Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Let's Talk. And once again tonight, I have Mikhail Kunneke. This is part two of Afrikaans Culture. Now, before we get started, okay, I have to mention this because I've kind of put myself in this situation where I need to remind people about the challenge that is going on at the moment, where I said I would get a tattoo if I hit 5,000 subscribers before the 16th of August. I have a link in the description below which will take you to my website, which has all the details. And I know people kind of roll their eyes when they see the T's and C's, but please, the T's and C's aren't that bad. It's really like only two things that I'm asking. And when you go to the link, you'll see and you'll get how this works. And on Thursday, I'll be doing a live stream to explain a little bit more detail and to spitball some ideas for tattoo designs. So tune into that one. Okay, now that that's out of the way, like I said, you guys can go to the link and find out more. I'm here with Mikhail Kunneke. We're going to continue our discussion about Afrikaans culture, which, if you haven't seen it yet, the first part is also in the description below. Please go check that out. And we're going to continue. I believe, Mikhail, correct me if I'm wrong, we were going to start or continue from concentration camps, I think.
Okay, well, we're hopefully not that dark immediately.
Or was it the fourth track? I can't remember now.
No, we reached about close to the end, not completely yet, but the end of the discussion with regards to the Second Anglo-Boer War.
Yes.
So we were there, give or take, but there's still another, hopefully in the next hour. I wouldn't mind a part 3, but hopefully next hour we can cover the second 100 years of history and time.
Cool.
But it's just as rich as the first one, so I doubt it, but we'll try. We'll see if we can hopefully just do another part 2. So
cool. And then do you want to give that disclaimer?
Yeah, let me do my disclaimer again. Firstly, welcome back everyone watching. Those that watched part 1, thank you so much. I really enjoyed doing part 1, and I really enjoyed being given the platform to discuss the culture that I identify with. And I think it's interesting, and in the current climate, I think if I can help people understand Afrikaner culture a bit better, then I'm thankful for the opportunity. So all the new people watching, thank you. Go back to the first video if there's anything we referred to tonight you're not sure about. And then obviously those people that came here from part 1, thank you so much for coming back. Let me just start with my disclaimer once again. I want to make it very, very clear that even though we're discussing Afrikaner and culture in general, certain organizations and groupings and so forth, I do not necessarily identify with, represent, or adhere to any of their constitutions or moral values and policies. So, for example, if I mention tonight the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, which is the AWB, it's purely discussion. I do not represent them. I do not speak on their behalf. That same goes for Solidarity and AfriForum and Orania and the Freedom Front Plus and the Afrikaner Broerbond. All these people and all these organizations that do come up, firstly, I do not represent them or speak on their behalf. Secondly, I will be speaking mostly, as with the first video, in general terms. This is just because it's easier to do it that way. Yes, as with any culture, we are a collective that consists of many individuals. But if I had to speak to every single individual within the Afrikaner community or people that identify as Afrikaner, we would be doing a 6 months to a year lecture circuit. I wouldn't mind doing that, but we don't have the time for that. So if there is anything you disagree with, that's absolutely fine. We are all welcome to our own opinions. And there might be many Afrikaners watching tonight that feel differently with regards to what Afrikaner culture is. You're more than welcome. What I'm discussing tonight is very much, as with part 1, based on historical research. So things like the first Anglo-Boer War, our border war we fought in the 60s to the late 80s. All that is based on historical research. So there I try to be as factual as possible. The culture in general, I will, unfortunately, as I stated, make 1 or 2 generalizations, but because it's just easier to speak of the collective than the individual. That is based on, obviously, my own personal opinion and feelings towards being an Afrikaner, and also on research. So 1 or 2 things. Let's say, for example, all Afrikaners like blue. That's just based on the research I've done. That does not necessarily mean I think all Afrikaners like blue, and it doesn't mean that if you speak to an Afrikaner tomorrow, they will automatically like blue. It's once again just based on a general, broader research that was being done.
Just like not all Afrikaners drink brandy and Coke, which is something
Yes,
I
I know.
found out last time.
Many people are upset about that, but it's true. So yeah, obviously everyone enjoy. Once again, if you do disagree, that's absolutely fine.
And comments. Let us know in the live chats. If you do disagree, we'll discuss it, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm trying to cover as many bases as I can. I can't cover all of them specifically down to the point of the individual. It's extremely difficult to do that with its time given. Any case, back to the show. All right, so we discussed the Second Anglo-Boer War, and we were unfortunately on the topic of the concentration camps and the scorched earth policy. The war, obviously, the war did start petering out. The Afrikaner or the Boer guerrilla forces were finding it more and more difficult to hit British troops out in the open and so forth. But this was largely due to the fact that because the scorched earth policy cut off many of the farms that the Boer guerrillas used as supply routes and places to rest and to restock and resupply, this became more and more difficult. Unfortunately, Lord Kitchener's scorched earth policy and the concentration camps did have the result they wanted. The British wanted to demoralize the Boer soldiers, or the militias, or the guerrilla fighters, whatever you want to call them. And it ended up working. It became more and more difficult for Boers to fight against the English, knowing that their wives and children and many of the workers that are loyal to them are being placed in concentration camps, and their farms have been burned to the ground or basically annexed by the state. So the Second Anglo-Boer War finished, or was signed, the treaty to say we surrender on 31st of May, 1902. Now, a little interesting fact. The last shot ever fired was in a small town in the Northern Cape called Okip, where, interesting enough, my wife's family resides from. So I found that very, very interesting when we started dating, that the last shot ever fired in the Anglo-Boer War was actually from the small town there where my family-in-law hails from. So that's quite cool. Obviously, with the surrender and accepting that we've lost, we lost the two republics, the Orange Free State and the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, or the South African Republic, which is now mostly Transvaal, Gauteng. That was obviously taken by the British. And with that, especially in Gauteng, all the mining regions. It was before the Second Anglo-Boer War, it was very much an economic stronghold for the Boers, especially those in politics and so forth. But with the loss of the Second Anglo-Boer War, a lot of that power and influence and economic strength went. So that's why I say that it's not the first time in history that the Boers, or later on as we know them as Afrikaners, lost our wealth. Once again, we can discuss whether those rights were gained fairly or unfairly, but it was very much a nation that, or a culture that, lost most of what they worked very hard for. Between 1902 and 1914, Afrikaners were mostly laborers, working class. We were blue collar. And I think there's still very much in Afrikaner culture that bit of pride and joy in being hard-working people, because for a very long time we didn't have a choice. Yes, you had one or two people that were Afrikaners in power, but they still answered to the English government and the colonial government at large. So it was still very difficult for Boers who started slowly becoming or identifying as Afrikaners to really be independent and do their own thing. And then in 1914, give or take, when the First World War started, we had a lovely thing called the Afrikaner Rebellion of 1914, where we stood up against the British. Now I'm going to get to a little fact. We're actually very linked to the Irish with regards to that. So it was because after the first or the second Anglo-Boer War, Afrikaners found it very, very difficult to strengthen themselves financially again. So a lot of them were working on the mines, when a lot of them were, as I said, laborers and so forth. And it was a combination of things that started the rebellion. Firstly, a lot of Afrikaners were working on the mines and in the mines, and a protest and disillusionment with the employees came about wages. The Afrikaners felt that they were working in terrible, very dangerous situations. Today, it's still very much the same if you work in the mines. And they were being pushed to work extremely long hours for very, very little pay. And obviously, by then, most of the mines were owned by British consortiums. So the Afrikaners felt, okay, it's 12 years later, and we're still under the boot of the English, and we can't take it anymore. So it's one of the little sparks that caused the Afrikaner rebellion. Another one is the death of General de la Rey. Now, General de la Rey, as many people hopefully know, was a very successful general during the Second Anglo-Boer War and had started venturing into politics more and more and more. And then by the same time, with the outbreak of the First World War, the English, obviously being a colony, South Africa was sort of obligated to fight as a Commonwealth in the First World War. But obviously Afrikaners, still being very upset about what happened 12 years earlier, were not in favor of it. So a large summit was held with people such as Jan Smuts and Louis Botha, and General de la Rey was on his way to the summit. Now, many would argue that he was the swing vote. If his vote went through, there was a possibility that South Africa might have remained neutral, or at the least, Boers, Afrikaners would not fight in the conflict at all. Sadly, General de la Rey was running a bit late, and he told his driver to obviously drive as fast as possible to the summit. And on their way, they went through a police roadblock, and they were shot. There was no malintent or whatnot. What happened is there was actually a Western-style bank robbers called the Foster Gang that had been robbing banks and places where money was stashed and held, and the roadblock was meant for them. But due to misinformation and not really having long-distance radios that were effective by then, they mistook General de la Rey's car for the Foster Gang, and he was shot while rushing through the roadblock. The driver obviously assumed that the roadblock was there so that they could go through to hold up traffic, but so it didn't happen. The Afrikaner Rebellion was short and sweet. It didn't go on for very, very, very long. It was squashed very quickly. But it was the first time since the Second Anglo-Boer War where Afrikaners, starting to identify as Afrikaners, were starting to get some pride back and stand up for themselves. Unfortunately, it wasn't very successful because the end game was not only in better wages, avoiding fighting the First World War, but they wanted the re-establishment of the South African Republic, or the Transvaal as we know it. That was the end game. That was the big boy goal. We wanted to have our own republic again. If we are on a republic, we don't have to fight in this war that we don't agree with, and we don't have to listen to the English, hopefully, anymore. Now, interesting little fact, the Irish Rebellion of 1916 directly resulted from this. Because the Afrikaner Rebellion, obviously we all know the Irish aren't very, very happy with the English, and to this day it's split between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But the 1916 rebellion against the English by the Irish, and there are historical documents where it clearly states that these rabble-rousers clearly quote their inspiration coming from the Afrikaners that stood up to the English and their rebellion. Now, by extension, if the Afrikaner Rebellion never happened, the Irish Rebellion would never have happened. And about 75 years later, the Cranberries would have never written the song Zombie. Because the song Zombie is about the Irish Rebellion and what came from it. So, us Afrikaners can claim we inspired the Cranberries to their most famous song.
I
Via.
think maybe some people will argue, but Yeah, why not?
No. It's. I don't think if you ask any of the members of Cranberries when they wrote the song Zombie, they went, yeah, because the Boers were badass people. That's why we're writing this song. No. The song is about the Irish Rebellion of 1916 and everything that came thereafter. The song discusses things such as the IRA and all those things, but the Irish Rebellion was directly a result of what happened during the Afrikaner Rebellion. I think that's quite cool that we didn't have the same effect as what the American and the French revolutions had on one another. But it's quite cool as an Afrikaner knowing that our little standing up for our rights influenced someone somewhere else.
Yeah, that makes
I
sense.
think it's a really, really cool piece of history. It also maybe gives more substantial evidence to the fact that Afrikaners are belligerent by nature. Because the interesting little thing is if you look at the first and second Anglo-Boer War, and if you look at the Afrikaner Rebellion of 1940, most of these have always, or all three of these basically occurred because Afrikaners were pushed into a corner and got tired of it. That's why last week I said quite a few times that Afrikaners, in general, for everyone watching, in general, Afrikaners prefer to be left alone. I think we have our knee-jerk reaction as a culture when we pushed into a corner and we can't really get out of it. And as with the Second Anglo-Boer War, and even the Afrikaner Rebellion, it came over time. It wasn't today we find tomorrow we've been cornered. It's a point where, okay, we'll let it slide, we'll let it slide, we'll let it slide. And then there reaches a point where, okay, we can't slide back any further. It's either into a corner or off a cliff. And I think with regards to Afrikaner culture, I think that's still very much ingrained in us, most of us. I think Afrikaners, once again, to clarify, Afrikaners are not simply just white Boersians. The Afrikaner culture in general is people that identify as Afrikaner, usually first-speaking Afrikaans individuals raised in Afrikaans home, prefer to be educated in Afrikaans, and usually Afrikaans is very well linked with the Calvinistic faith and a bit more conservative. Obviously not the same for everyone, but in general, it's a bit more conservative and withdrawn. And obviously you get people that are Afrikaans that choose not to identify as Afrikaners. My wife is very much Afrikaans. She comes from the Makwaland, which is one of the few cornerstones of being an Afrikaner. It's like a little outpost there in the Northern Cape. And she's very much Afrikaans, but she doesn't identify as Afrikaner. So there is a difference. You can be Afrikaans and not identify as an Afrikaner, and you can be an Afrikaner and be a person of color. As I said last week, a lot of coloreds identify as, for example, in this case, as Namakwalanders and by extent Afrikaners. A lot of black people in Free State, as I said last week as well. A lot of black people in the Free State speak Afrikaans, and you will come across quite a few of them that identify as an Afrikaner, not just purely because they speak Afrikaans as a first language.
Yeah.
But Afrikaners in general, as a culture, we want to be left alone and we want to go about and do our own thing. I think the problem arises when we pushed over time gradually into a corner where we can't really deal with it. Unfortunately, obviously, to get back to it, General De La Rey was shot on his way to the summit, so his possible swing vote never happened. The Afrikaner Rebellion was squashed, so we never got our new republic or our reinstituted republic, and we fought in the First World War, and we did surprisingly well. Obviously, we didn't have the same amount of troops, but we did very, very well. And then after the First World War, by 1918, we had the Great Spanish Flu, the 100-year, basically the Kong Flu, just 100 years earlier. And once again thereafter, by the 1920s, Afrikaners came home to death and very little wealth. You didn't really have wealth after the First World War. But here by the 1920s, more and more people started identifying as Afrikaners. That culture was starting to ingrain itself. We'd started moving away from identifying as Boers and more towards being Afrikaners. And I think one of the great catalysts of that is the Afrikaner Rebellion of 1914, because it was referred to by themselves as the Afrikaner Rebellion, not the Boer Rebellion. We'd also started streamlining the language. Obviously, Afrikaans is still very much influenced by German, French, English, Malay, Arabic. But the Afrikaans language, as we know today, as an academic language, was starting to fall. More and more people were starting to write in Afrikaans, not purely just correspondence, but also things like literature, poetry, music. Plays started more and more being written in Afrikaans. But obviously the 1920s were difficult for many people. And by the 1920s, we were still a union, and still very much part of the Commonwealth. But you started seeing Afrikaners, and essentially the beginning of the NP government started getting to more and more positions of authority. So, for example, by 1948, the NP government had won election and it was in power, even though we were a Commonwealth between 1948 and becoming a republic in 1961. It was NP led. But in the 20s, Afrikaners were starting to identify more and more as Afrikaners, and you had one or two organizations prop up that stood for the Afrikaner and defended the Afrikaner and tried to increase the wealth of the Afrikaners. So by the late 1920s, early 1930s, you had organizations such as the ATKV, which is the Afrikaans Language and Culture Association. Now, by extension, obviously, their main focus is promoting Afrikaans culture, literature, music, and so forth. But they did have a financial scheme as well, where they would try and empower. It was essentially an Afrikaner version of BEE. If I have to simplify it, where Afrikaners, even till today, almost 100 years later, you still get many ATKV holiday resorts, which are for Afrikaners that are associated with the organization. You get a bit better rates and whatnot to go on holiday. It makes it more affordable and with great facilities. I have to admit, I've been to one or two, and the facilities are absolutely brilliant for the price you pay. So things like that started to come in. And then we had the lovely little thing in 1918, the Afrikaner Broederbond was established, which basically translates to the Afrikaner Brotherhood. Now I need to clarify, that which they became by the 1980s and that which they were when they started are two different things. And we'll get to that. The Afrikaner Broederbond...
You're talking about the Boer Mafia?
Yeah. Okay, firstly, the Boer Mafia and the Stellenbosch Mafia is not a thing. So
I think you have to say that.
It's not a thing.
Yeah, sure.
But you can argue by extension it sort of is the same thing. So the Afrikaner Broederbond, or the Afrikaner Brotherhood, was established with the same purpose as the ATKV, to empower Afrikaners and Afrikaners' families and start generating wealth again, not just through farming and blue-collar labor. But they were much more financial and economically minded than the ATKV. So they purely focused on business and economic growth and helping small businesses. So it was a lot easier if you became a member to network between other Afrikaner-owned business people. Now,
it's like a club.
Yeah, it's basically like a club, but the
Boer Mafia.
benefits. We did not carry around Tommy guns. We carried around shotguns and brandies and coke, apparently. That was our fighting stock. Take a sip of brandy and then apparently shoot someone. Because Afrikaners have this fascination with shotguns. Very few of us own them, but we have a fascination with them for some reason. I don't know why. That's the one thing I can't clarify historically or socially. But yeah, the Afrikaner Broederbond was purely there to help economic growth between one another and so forth. So unfortunately, the sad thing is, being the times, Afrikaners of color were not allowed to join, which is sad. I think the Afrikaner population as a whole, the culture as a whole, would be still probably today be better off economically if that was opened up. But the sad thing is we have to look at the times. You still had the Native Lands Act of 1913 that was put into place. By 1948, the MP government took power. By 1961, we truly started having apartheid. So even from 1918 onwards, it became more and more difficult for people of color that identified as Afrikaner to get the same leg up. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to mention that. But as I said, so you started here by the late 20s, and obviously before the economic crash, when Wall Street fell and obviously affected the whole world, Afrikaners were slowly and surely, a select few, were starting to empower themselves, starting to create small businesses and also start supporting each other in their small businesses. And obviously, many of those businesses started growing. Companies such as Sanlam and Santam, who's an insurance company, they started also growing more and more because they started showing a preference towards Afrikaners, because these were Afrikaner established, or in many cases, for example, in Santam's case, established by still Boers. So it made a lot more sense to give better insurance and life policy rates and so forth for Afrikaners by Afrikaners. So there was this carryover effect starting. And the Afrikaner Broederbond started growing and growing and growing. And before we continue with the history, I'll quickly just go on that tangent with regards to the Boer Mafia, as Joe likes to call it. We don't sit around the table going like this saying, yeah, we're gonna rob a bank, saying, yeah, we gotta buy some brandy, saying, yeah. No, we don't.
That's not how I picture it. I picture it in a room, in a cellar, in a wine farm, like a hidden cellar, right? In a wine farm, in the back, like Prohibition days, where you guys get together, you're playing poker, there's brandy and Coke for everyone. No, like endless supplies of it, but like the good brandy, like the really, really good aged brandy with some
With
biltong
Coke, no,
snacks.
we do have standards. We won't drink proper brandy with Coke. We're not that bad.
Some might, and then like some biltong like snackies in the middle, and then you guys are just like, ja, lekker boys, ons gaan nou braai.
Okay, so basically, the Boer Mafia existed purely for the purpose of organizing social gatherings, which involved brandy and braai.
They'll talk about shit. Obviously, I don't know what they'll talk about. Fuck.
But as much as we joke about it, later on, that's pretty much what the Afrikaner Broederbond started becoming. It became a lot more inclusive, and exclusive by extent as well. So you started seeing, especially here from the 50s onwards, its peak was definitely in the late 70s. The 80s, it started to die down a bit. But the Afrikaner Broederbond had moved away from empowering the average blue-collar Afrikaner to more and more enriching the middle class and upwards. They still had projects and things in place for the working-class blue-collar Afrikaner, but their main focus was more and more washing each other's hands and covering each other's backs. And it became a lot more, as I said, exclusive.
That sounds very mafia-like, Mikhail. I'm just saying.
I can't speak on behalf of any dodgy things they did. No, there is some research being done, and obviously it was no secret that you had many members of parliament that were members, hiring ranking officials at places such as Eskom, Eskom, Denel, were members, and all your state departments, whether it was agriculture, whether it was water and sanitation, whether it was transport, there was always a member of the Afrikaner Broederbond there, and they were more likely to climb the ladder a lot quicker than the other people on the staff. And they were, I don't want to call it secret meetings because then I'm strengthening your argument, but
but they were.
There were meetings held at undisclosed locations. At times you'd only know of an hour before. Interesting little fact, my uncle was a member. I only found out after he passed away.
You just proved my point that you can't say that they exist because you're linked to them. You see what I mean? But it's cool. I read what you're saying, man.
Yeah.
I get it.
Um, no, my
Can
uncle
I
was my.
join?
You identify as an Afrikaner.
I'll identify as an Afrikaner. Yes.
Can you speak Afrikaans fluently?
That's not supposed to be
It was a
I can
prerequisite for the
braai.
African. No, that's not that allows you to stand in front of the door, but it doesn't allow you to go through the
I'll
door.
be the door guy. I'll be the
Yeah,
door guy.
and then you can be the valet.
Okay, fine.
So, but you can't go through the door. You have to speak Afrikaans fluently. You have to sit down with the annotate classes.
Okay, fine.
So that definitely needs to be done. No, I only found out after he passed away that my uncle was a member. My grandfather was offered, but he declined it. So you did have Afrikaners even in the 60s until the 80s that didn't agree with the Afrikaner Broederbond, but it was based on the fact that they'd started moving away from the ideology they'd set up in the 20s and the 30s. So there were Afrikaners feeling that you stand for something, but what you stand for now is not what you stood for then. Obviously, by 1994, the influence and the power they had in government obviously diminished. And the Afrikaner Broederbond tried to rebrand itself very much such as an Afriforum and solidarity type movement. But they are overall very, very quiet. I think their heyday is very much past. I think they can still help. I think if they revised what they are and go back to what they were in the 20s and the 30s and very much did what Afriforum and Solidarity do now, I think they could be of help. But with regards to wheeling and dealing and power mongering and that, I don't think, and rightly so. They did have an unfair system and a system very much in their favor, and they definitely plucked all the fruit for it.
Well,
But they all.
to your point, you could. I mean, a lot of people have said that the ANC is like a mafia, is like a gangster kind of place because only the elite that are high up in ANC benefit from each other, benefit from doing business deals together, and therefore keeping most of the wealth within a certain amount of people or friends or family or whatever, what have you. So I imagine that's what you're talking about. That's kind of what happened back then.
Yeah, it was. I think the only difference, there are two differences that I would, based on the research I've done, and if you look at what certain people within the ANC government are doing today, the Afrikaner Broederbond did it over a longer time period. So it wasn't a lot of wealth, and then in 25, 26 years, everything was stolen. It was done gradually over a 50-year time period. So it was less likely to notice that these people were enriching themselves, apart from gaining political favor and whatnot. Secondly, what they still did, at least what I think the ANC could be possibly more streamlined with regards to corruption if they did this.
Don't give them ideas. The fuck are you doing, dude?
I am very, very, very fortunate. I'm Afrikaner. No one in the ANC government will ever listen to me, so I can spout this as much as I want.
Okay.
They still had the upliftment projects in place. Not as many, but there was still consistency with regards to that. Where the ANC has stolen, obviously going a bit off topic now, but the ANC has taken a lot of wealth, and the working class is just becoming poorer and poorer and poorer. The Afrikaner Broederbond were doing the same thing, but there was still at least a certain amount of upliftment. So there was enough money for the working class, for the blue-collar Afrikaner, for the lower middle-class Afrikaner to not get upset. Because, see, they're doing dodgy stuff, but I'm making more this month than I did last month. So it's sort of, I think if the ANC followed that policy, they might have gotten away with corruption a bit more for a bit longer. But luckily they would listen to me, so it probably would happen.
This is all wrong, by the way. We're not condoning this behavior. No one should go out and do this shit.
It's definitely true. The fact that the Afrikaner Broederbond stood for Afrikaners, but obviously only a certain race of Afrikaners, firstly, is deplorable. Once again, I think Afrikaner as a culture in general would be much better off today, and with greater means to help other people economically if they were more inclusive here from from 1918 onwards. I think a lot of apartheid policies were very much influenced by members of the Afrikaner Broederbond. I haven't done the necessary research. I don't think someone has looked into it. But if you look at forcible removal such as District 6 for redevelopment purposes, there were most likely Afrikaner Broederbond members that financially benefited from it. There was a member at least at every level within government in some sort, and many members were part of corporations and standalone businesses that sponsored government and so forth. So the Afrikaner Broederbond, I think, second-handedly affected apartheid more than I think we know. So no, and it's very sad that they moved away so far from what they started out to be. They started out, and that's what I very much appreciate about AfriForum and Solidarity. Once again, I'm not speaking on their behalf, it's purely of what I've seen and what I've read, is they haven't started making that movement. They aren't doing that. We represent Afrikaners on a union level, on a legal level, on a social level, and on an arts level. But that's it. There's not an interest in politics. Nowhere in the past 5 years have you read that Solidarity and AfriForum, which are part of the same little umbrella, are planning on going into politics. Yes, they have doings with Freedom Front Plus, but that's just because Freedom Front Plus is very much, in general, an Afrikaner political party. So there are obviously business dealings and political dealings, but it's not the same thing where Solidarity is pushing people into parliament in different positions and whatnot. So it's very sad that the Afrikaner Broederbond moved so far away from what they meant to be. Their pure basis was to economically empower the Afrikaner, because we lost so much due to the Second Anglo-Boer War, and we struggled before the First World War, and everyone was buggered after the First World War economically. And they came to strength after the stock market crash. They really hit high gear with regards to upliftment programs and projects. So here until at least 1948, when the MP government took power, I think the Afrikaner Broederbond did a lot of good work. But the sad thing is, with anything in life, when you start getting political favor, it can go corrupt very, very, very quickly. And I think Afrikaner Broederbond, if they'd stayed to their original established morals and values, I think they would still be relevant today. They would be an extra helping hand. It would not only be Solidarity and AfriForum and organizations like that that help us. We would have had an extra hand in the fight.
All right, well, before you continue, I just want to get to some of these comments that are coming through. So thank you all so much once again for listening in. We have reached the halfway point, so Mikhail, you can give your disclaimer again in just a moment. We have an increase in views, so thank you all so much for tuning in. We have Nabila watching. Thank you, Nabila, for tuning in. Robin Hassan is back. Thank you, Robin. We have Bradley Cook, Rudy Roo, and a few others that have commented. I have a question here. Well, I think he was just commenting on when we were joking a bit, but Tommy is saying, sounds like the Freemasons. I don't know about that.
No, if obviously there's so much, the fight between conspiracy and fact with organizations like the Freemasons is rife. It's very difficult to prove something, and when you do, what you've proven is possibly only 10% of what the bigger picture is. I do think it wouldn't be a leap to say that it had a bit of that structure. Not saying we were this big new world order.
Well, Robin says Illuminati confirmed.
The lucky thing is, in general, Afrikaners we want to do our own thing. So I think joining the Illuminati was the last on our priority lists. And I think the New World Order as well. I don't think we'd give a shit what happens outside of our borders.
Fair enough.
I think if someone were to do the research, and I think it would be an interesting topic to read on myself, I think one or two structural elements might be the same, but it could be purely just coincidence.
That's true.
Organizations like that do have a certain structure, and if the structure works, you don't really veer off from it.
Yeah.
It's not really, you don't reinvent the wheel with an organization like that, but it'd be quite an interesting study. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same. I wouldn't say it's really similar. I think there might be coincidental similarities between two with regards to how it's structured.
And John Smith says he knows his stuff. He's saying you know your stuff.
Oh, thank you.
Oh man, I cannot read this. Undying Brush. Oh, Undying Brush QW says enjoying a liquor beer and listening in the Congo. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in. And Robin asks, she wants me to ask you if you know about, I'm not sure how you pronounce the first name, but I'm going to try Sinner.
Sinner van Rensburg.
Yeah, shit, you're good.
Well, it's our little myth. Sinner van Rensburg was very much part of the Second Anglo-Boer War, and he had a Nostradamus effect. So he would make predictions with regards to battles that we would take part in with the English. He would predict or foresee outcomes and so forth. There's the argument that's been made that, for example, he foresaw the death of General de la Rey. But as with Nostradamus, it's a lot easier confirming something after you said you predicted it would happen. Or if you predict something to happen and something similar happens, it's very people usually want to automatically make a connection. So I'll predict a great hero has fallen, and tomorrow, let's say, someone passes away of political. Kofi Annan passes away tomorrow. Now it's very easy to go, oh yeah, but see, he said a great person of hero political value passed away. It's going to happen soon. But whether you believe in predictions or not, these predictions, by luck, many of them were true. And I think from a morale point of view, I think the Boers and the Commandos very much benefit from it. There was definitely a psychological element to it. But Sinner, like I said, Sinner van Rensburg was essentially the soothsayer for the Boers during the Second Anglo-Boer War. It's obviously very easy to want to dispute whether what he predicted was right or wrong. But he had a great effect on morale. If he predicted tomorrow we will win this fight, you had a greater likelihood that the people in that commando started believing more that they would.
And therefore, because their morale was up, they fought harder, more with confidence, and therefore they could win, or they won.
Yeah, and then
therefore
the circle,
people, yeah.
And then it strengthens the argument that Sinner van Rensburg knows the future.
Interesting.
Now, obviously, it would be very difficult to research whether he knew personally that what he was doing was just basically psychologically boosting the people, or whether he believed that he was born with being Afrikaners and Boers and our connection with Calvinistic beliefs, whether he was born with a God-given gift. That would be difficult to confirm what side of the line he was on. But it's very easy to definitely see that from a morale point of view, he had a great influence, and he did have an effect on the outcomes of certain skirmishes and on conflicts because of that psychological boost he gave.
Cool. Well, Ruth here. Ruth, thank you so much for tuning in. She says, how's it? Chico's just joined us as well. And Ranger Jakes is also, they're all saying hi. And Robin says, that was awesome, Mikhail. I'm impressed. Nicholas was a boer and a sort of prophet indeed. All right, so it's a bit past the halftime. We have to close up pretty soon. But I don't know if you want to give that disclaimer again.
Okay, once again, for the people joining just now, thank you so much. If you've missed anything and you want to get a bit of background, watch the beginning of this video. And if it's your first time truly here, please go back to part 1 and definitely watch that so you have all the background. Once again, I want to clarify. Firstly, we're discussing Afrikaner culture. I would like to just purely state that an Afrikaner and Afrikaans-speaking individual aren't necessarily the same thing. An Afrikaner, by most people's definition, is a person that is Afrikaans-speaking first language, usually raised in Afrikaans first language home, and would in most cases raise their children in Afrikaans-speaking home. And they are more than likely to adhere to a slightly more conservative Calvinistic moral and value system. And Afrikaners aren't defined by race. We're defined as a culture. You get many, many people of different races that identify as Afrikaner. The Northern Cape in the Free State, Eastern Cape as well. I've come across one or two. And you don't have to, once again, you don't have to be an Afrikaner identify, or the other way around. You don't, if you're Afrikaans speaking, you don't necessarily identify as an Afrikaner. Secondly, the historical facts that I'm going through and discussing with Joe, I've tried my utmost best to research it as well as I could. Luckily, I did political science and history in university, and I've kept on reading thereafter. So this is very much an interest of mine, and I try to read as much academic source material as possible. So I try to be as close to the truth as I can. With regards to my opinions, they are very much my own, based on my own emotions, my feelings towards my culture, and research I've done. I do not represent Afrikaners in general. I do not represent the population as a whole. I do not represent any of the organizations, past and present, that we've discussed. I do not speak on their behalf. I'm not endorsed by them. And I just want to clarify, I state this so that if there's anything I say that might be contradictory to what they believe and stand for, they can distance themselves from me. Once again, I've been speaking largely in general terms because we're speaking of a culture as a whole. It's very, very difficult, firstly, to speak on behalf of every single individual that identifies as Afrikaner, and secondly, it would just make it a lot longer. So I will be making one or two, and I have made one or two generalizations. I try to base it as much on fact as I can, but if it's not, I do apologize. Once again, it's easier for me to speak of a general culture group than the individual, but it's always worth knowing that any culture, any grouping does consist of the individual. So once again, my favorite little example, if I say all Afrikaners like blue, it's not necessarily the case. And secondly, tomorrow, please don't assume that when you speak to someone that identifies as Afrikaner, assume that he likes blue. Otherwise, Joe gets the email going, "Dear Joe, Emilio, Mikhail said all Afrikaners like blue," and then I got hit in the face because it's not true. You don't have to do that.
No, I think yes. I think. Well, Robin was saying here, is this speech for the snowflakes who are easily offended? Well, yes and no. Again, we're just trying to. It's a disclaimer. It's just a disclaimer. I'm playing it safe. I just want to read here. Bismarck Bear said, when Boers overran a blockhouse, the Boer war cry could be heard down the fighting line, also boosting morale. Is that true?
Yes. Because we were using guerrilla tactics and militias, communication was key because the groupings were usually smaller, but communication is very, very, very key. And that it had two psychological effects. Firstly, it hopefully from a psychological point of view, obviously increased adrenaline being released by the Boer fighters, but it also had sort of a demoralizing effect on the English that were held up in a blockhouse or a little fort. not only are you being attacked from many points of place that you don't really know from where they're coming from, and secondly, you just hear these, in general, very gruff, bearded, haven't showered for 3 weeks, men with Mausers shooting at you and scaring the living shit out of you. So it had a psychological effect in the positive for the Boers. And once again, you have to, with any conflict, any battle, you want to have channels of communication, whether it is for strategies or just purely for morale. And then obviously it had a negative or in most cases had a negative psychological effect on the English trying to defend a position. So yes, that is very, very, very much true.
All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, and I really don't want to go over time because I want people to watch these series. So I'm going to quickly say this. Mikhail has inspired me to actually speak to other people, part of different cultures and ethnic groups, to talk about their culture as well. So there will be, throughout the coming few weeks, other people talking about colored culture. We're going to have, I forgot what Oba King is, but he's going to come on and talk about his culture. Tswana, thank you. So that is happening. Now, because we only have 9 minutes now, is there anything you want to say very quickly? Do you think we should do a part 3? And also, if you guys want a part 3, let us know.
Well, as with last week, I think it was last week, if the comment section want a part 3, I would gladly do it. As I said in the beginning of the video, I highly doubted we'd be able to cover the 2nd or the 20th century with regards to the Afrikaner and the culture and the history. I was hoping we could, but sadly we didn't. So I would love to do a part 3. So I would like to finish on a strong point as we started on one. But once again, it's up to the comment section whether they want a part 3. I think we would be able to finish off in a part 3. So I would like to do it. I would like to finish off what we started together. And obviously, in future, any other people discussing their cultures on your channel be afforded the same opportunity. If they need 2 or 3 parts to do so, then hopefully they can. So from my side, I would love to do a part 3. I don't know if you are still engaged, if you still find this very, very interesting. So it's up to you as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm for it. But I mean, okay, there we go. Yes, please. Part 3. I love some knowledge. Okay, cool. Then I'll do it for Robin. I don't care if anybody else doesn't want it. I'll do it for her. She's been watching part 1, part 2, and she's enjoying the conversation. So why not? And look, again, this is valuable information. This is how we tear down racial stereotypes, or not necessarily racial stereotypes, but just racism and stuff like that. When you understand someone's culture, you become less fearful of their culture, and therefore the racism kind of tones down a bit. Obviously, there's different levels to racism and how one would feel towards a certain group, and there's reasons for that. But this helps. This helps break down a barrier that you might think like Afrikaners are a certain way, but what Mikhail is telling you, you start to learn like, oh shit, I didn't know your people went through this. I didn't know this happened. I didn't know. It's very interesting, and I think this really helps, which is why I'm doing other cultures as well, and I'm also hugely fascinated by different cultures, and I love learning about different people and why they do certain things and their traditions and stuff like that. So it seems like, let me look here in the comments. Yes, we're getting a lot of yeses. Lucas said yes. Bismarck giving a little bit of a statement. Boers in the future would be good topic to hear. Or he's actually giving a suggestion. Boers in the future would be a good topic to hear. Remind me again, why is Boer and Afrikaner different? I thought they were the same.
The one became the other. So obviously we firstly identified as Dutch because we were first generation Dutch settlers. I just want to clarify one thing before I continue. The Dutch never planned on colonizing this lovely little country. Jan van Riebeeck... No, I need to clarify this. Jan van Riebeeck was sent here to open an engine one-stop and a wimpy. That's the only reason he was sent here. Secondly, he was sent here as punishment because he'd been caught for being a corrupt official within the Dutch East India Company. It was his punishment to be sent here. He came, he opened an engine one-stop, he opened a wimpy, and then 3 years later, I think he fucked off again.
He opened an engine one-stop.
We never originally, or the Dutch never originally viewed this place as colonization. They just wanted to open a Shell Ultra so that ships can stop, refuel, and then go up to the east. And there's more than enough documents proving that Jan van Riebeeck absolutely hated his stay here. He hated the few years he was here. He never wanted to be here. He never wanted to come here. But he was a corrupt bastard. So he was sent here sort of into exile. And then when he proved he's useful, he went back. So by extension, if anyone wants to blame Afrikaners for anything, it could be that we brought corruption to this country.
Oh yeah, well that's so much better.
Yeah, so we really did do a thing. But obviously, to get back to the point, so we Dutch settlers and by the Groot Trek, we were starting to identify more and more as Boers, as Boere, because as the Great Trek was starting to reach its endpoint, more and more of us became farmers and landowners.
Okay.
And by the Second Anglo-Boer War, we still identified as Boers. The identification as an Afrikaner started seeping through here by the 1914 Afrikaner Rebellion, because Afrikaans itself as a language was becoming more and more defined, and the culture was starting to streamline a bit. We were starting to have a better idea of our identity outside of being Boers. So those came through. And then here by the late 1930s and the 1940s, the NP government and organizers like the Afrikaner Broederbond latched onto this identity and started blowing it out of proportion. So that's why I said in part one, the Afrikaner identity as we know it in general was largely created by an Afrikaner-led government and political parties. It was a state-created identity, or basically a flushed-out identity by the state and by organizations such as the NP. But Boers, so we went from one identity and started flowing and starting finding our feet and became Boers, and then from Boers we started flowing and streamlining more and more and started identifying as Afrikaners. And then from a purely nationalism point of view, the NP government thought it's a very, very good foundation to build an Afrikaner nationalism on this identity. I think people like Piet Retief and Louis Trichardt during the Great Trek and individuals like Louis Botha and General De La Rey and Jan Smuts were very important to our culture and to our history. But where they were important individuals, I think the NP government had a hand in creating heroes of them. Whether they were or not, that's up for discussion and up to every individual on his own and his merits of what is deemed as a hero. But that hero status, that mythology, that legend of what Afrikaners are, the whole Boermarke plan, and we don't give up and we will always work our arse off. All those things that are now very much ingrained in us, had a political influence. Was influenced by politics.
Okay. Cool. So we have 2 minutes left. And where did we stop so that we know when part 3 comes along we're going to start from?
Okay, so we can basically go on from... We basically stopped here by 1930. So next week, we've covered the Boer Rebellion, or the Afrikaner Rebellion. We've covered the establishment of the RTK4 and the Afrikaner Broederbond, and the fact that Afrikaner...
Mafia, yeah.
Yes. You're still not allowed to go through the door, so sit outside and get cold. So we were there. Obviously, we discussed the Afrikaner Broederbond and how they'd moved away from what they were. We started clarifying more and more of how Afrikaner identity was starting to become ingrained in our culture and our society. So I think we can start looking at here from 1930 onwards and more, not only look at Afrikaner history, but also start focusing on the start of Afrikaner nationalism.
Cool.
Which had a great influence on apartheid, on the racist policies and the idea that Afrikaners are better than everyone and all that.
Okay, so the next one's going to be a bit of a tough thing to listen to in some aspects, I guess, for some people, not everyone. But it's I'm sure it will be factual and interesting to listen to.
I will really try my best to be as factual as possible, and I personally would like to end off on this. When I discussed this with Joe, the main purpose of me doing this is obviously, firstly, I am very proud of being an Afrikaner, and I'm staunch Afrikaner, and I always will be. Um, I am very proud of the good deeds we did, and I definitely am saddened and I acknowledge the terrible things we did. But I think in the current climate in South Africa that's becoming more and more racialized, sadly,
Mhm.
it's given me, hopefully, it gives me an opportunity to at least broaden people's mind a little bit of what Afrikaners are and how
Yes.
we identify and what we identify as.
Yeah.
If someone that disliked, I'm using this purely as an example, I'm not saying anyone watching is this. If anyone before part one or even part two had a great dislike for Afrikaners, and even after watching these two videos still have a dislike for Afrikaners, hopefully I've at least given you a better educated footing to make that opinion on. On the other hand, if you were on the fence about Afrikaners, hopefully I've given you the opportunity, thanks to Joe, to now give your decision. Now you can make an opinion or
Mm.
form an opinion of how you feel about Afrikaners and our history because I've given you some background.
Mm.
And then lastly, hopefully, because we've covered things in general and we've had to brush over some things and simplify some historical things, hopefully I've given you a starting point. If you're interested in history, even if you're an Afrikaner or not as an Afrikaner, you're interested in history, at least hopefully I've given you a place to now start off from. So I've now mentioned the concentration camps during the Second Anglo-Boer War. If that's your begin point to do your research, at least I've given you that starting line, hopefully. Um, Once again, I'm not doing this at all to prove a point that Afrikaners are better than anyone else. I'm not doing this to hide the atrocities of things such as apartheid and the fact that the Afrikaner Broederbond excluded Afrikaners of color from their projects and their policies. Um, I'm doing this so I can educate people,
Yeah.
hopefully. And I like talking about my culture. I usually, when I have these conversations, I have it with very like-minded people, other Afrikaners in general. So it's nice having a platform where I can discuss it with people coming from the other side of the fence.
Yes.
So I hope I could clarify a few things. And once again, um, the historical facts, I've tried to be as factual as possible. Luckily for me, I like reading about it and learning about it. And if I did make any generalization with regards to our cultures and whatnot, taking account it, I made it for the purpose of the video to bring across a point.
Well, look,
Um,
I think if anyone does have a problem, please leave a comment in the comment section after when we're done here. And we'll be happy to address it in the next video. I'm sure you wouldn't mind addressing what
no, I'll
your opinions
definitely
and stuff like
address
that.
it.
Yeah,
Once again, when it comes to opinions, I think we're all open to debate.
yeah,
And once again, how I identify as an Afrikaner differs, once again, from the individual,
yes,
from a different individual that identifies as Afrikaner.
yes,
That's a lovely thing about being people. We have different opinions.
exactly.
And my opinion can either enrich or degrade the culture and how it's viewed just as much as the next person.
Yeah.
Every opinion we have enriches or is supposed to enrich the culture and make it more diverse and intellectually speaking, better informed.
Well, again,
I think that's what we all aim for.
that's why we have these discussions. And look, I think it's safe to say we'll do another part 3. I will communicate with you when we'll do the date. I just wanted to say quickly, Robin Hassan says, took me a long time to find smart, open-minded people in South Africa, let alone Cape Town. So I'm enjoying your channel and others such as Germ, Ronaldo, Chris White, etc. It's awesome. So she's enjoying this conversation.
Well, thank you so much.
And then there were some other things. So I think we'll touch on this. I think we touched on this in the previous episode, but we can touch on it again in the next episode. So don't answer it. But I just want you to know that this question was asked, what do you think about Afrikaans? So they're asking you, what do you think about Afrikaans pop culture? So we'll talk about that next time. And then...
No, the last video I just ripped into Steve Hofmeyer. We didn't really discuss Afrikaner pop culture in general.
Okay.
So we can definitely, I think we can, before we get into the very dark and deep, really ugly history of the 20th century, I think it's a nice topic to start off with, just to lighten the mood a bit.
Maybe we should, if it's a light topic, maybe we should leave it for the end then.
Yeah, we could. I'd rather have my ice cream before the meat and potatoes, but It's
And then
it's
Chico says, Mikhail would be interested, I guess, to know my family is connected to Smuts. He says that his great grandparents were in concentration camps. He has the photos to prove it. So yeah, that's actually interesting, Chico. I hope you'll join us for the next one, and maybe comment some of your stories, or even comment in the comment section some of your stories, and we'll talk about it. And then Mr. Punisher saying, "Sorry, I am late, but I'll be watching the upload from the beginning. Hope to make part 3 live." Okay, thanks, guys. Cool.
all right.
So,
Awesome.
ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for listening and tuning in. And the reason why we did this at so early is because I have load shedding in my area, unfortunately, at 8, which is also why we can't go too much over time. So, yeah, we will just keep an eye on my channel. If you haven't yet subscribed, you will get notified with when the next one is going to be available. And as I said, I'm going to have interviews like this based on cultures a little bit more often throughout the coming weeks. So please look out for that. Mikhail, once again, thank you for your time and thank you for all the information. I think a lot of people are still impressed with the knowledge that you have. And hopefully I can get your wife on the channel because she's also a history buff and I would be interested to talk to her. So, yeah, other than that, buddy, enjoy your evening. I'll give you a proper goodbye just now. Yeah, interesting chat. Everyone's saying interesting chat and thanks, guys. So, is there anything you want to say very quickly?
No, just once again, shortly, thank you everyone for watching. Doesn't matter what part you came in, thank you for watching. Hopefully you've learned from this. We're looking forward to part 3, and thank you guys for making part 3 happen. I would really like to finish off what Joe and I started here. And then we'll see you soon.
Awesome.
Obviously, keep a like and subscribe on his channel, and for the notifications. Obviously, the only reason you need to get notification bell is so that when my video comes up, you can watch it.
Yeah, and then you can switch it off.
Yeah, you can switch it off after part 3. I really couldn't get. I can share still, but after part 3, you can switch off the bell, and it's fine.
All right, and then if you want to join us, just so you guys know, tomorrow evening we will be doing. You will be seeing Mikhail again on my channel, but we won't be talking about Afrikaans culture. We'll be talking about woke. We're continuing the conversation. That's part 3 of To Be Woke or Not to Be Woke. It's been a very fascinating, interesting conversation thus far. And we'll be joined with Venner Weber, Peter Sawanga, and Oba King Moreau will be on the show as well. All of them comedians talking about wokeness. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, my tattoo challenge. Link in the description if you want to know more about that. Get me to 5K subs, and I will get a tattoo of your choosing. So go read about that in the description below. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next one. Cheers.
Cheers.